I'm going to ask the participants to um, switch off their videos other than the people who are on the panel today. So for Dinara and Serena from UNU Flores, as well as Britt Regal, who's our presenter today, and I will give it a number of minutes so everyone can join because it usually takes a few seconds. All right, so I'll just wait for a little bit longer until everyone has joined the meeting. It usually takes a minute or two, and then we will get started. All right, and so I'll just give it a few more seconds and then we will get started. And I think that's been enough time. I hope everyone was able to join and can hear us now. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the 78th seminar, the Nexus seminar that is hosted together from TU Dresden and with UNU Flores. And I'm really glad that there's two new hosts from UNU Flores side, and that's Dinara and Serena. And I would like to invite you to briefly introduce yourself to the group as the two new co-host.
Hi, everybody. So I'm very happy to be here. My name is Serena Kutsia. I joined UNU Flores recently, and I'm going to be co-hosting the Nexus seminar series together with Samanti. Well, until very recently, I was in South Africa, and I work in geoinformatics, so I'm very much looking forward to this. Dinara.
Thank you. My name is Dinara Dikhanbayeva. I am Educational Program Associate at UNU Flores. I will be administrating the Nexus seminar series. And welcome, join the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm very glad to be co-hosting this with the two of you. And so today, I'm really glad that in this semester, Britt Regal, or Dr. Britt Regal, because we're in the German system, we say Dr. Britt Regal is kicking off the seminar. And Britt will be giving a presentation on co-creating transformative innovation policy for disruptive sustainability, navigating its discontents. And a little bit of background on Britt. Britt is originally from the US and pursued her undergrad there, but then moved on to the UK where she pursued her master's at King's College as well as her PhD. And both of that, I think that's really interesting for this context, not in the sustainability background, but with a focus on organizing for co-production and the role of leadership cultures. But since then, you've started working on sustainability topics, first together with the Productivity Institute and in cooperation already with the Center for Sustainable Business that is newly launched at King's College, and then also directly with the Center for Sustainable Business just recently. So I'm really glad that you agreed to join us today. And with that, I'll hand over to you and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dinara, Serena, and Samanti. It's such a pleasure to be able to be here today at the Nexus seminar, coming off of some really interesting conversations where I met Samanti in Munich on a sustainability conference. So to begin, my very long and mouthful of a title, Co-Creating Transformative Innovation Policy for Disruptive Sustainability, Navigating Its Discontents. And this research project actually brought together 4 different perspectives. As Monty mentioned, I have a background in public administration, really focusing on co-creation, co-production, bringing relevant and affected actors to come together to discuss pertinent issues that are affecting society today. Alongside myself, there was Damien Grimshaw, who focuses on skills and employment and labor and the impact of transitions, whether digital or sustainability, on communities and whether or not they have the skills and such. Marcela Miozzo is innovation, as well as Jonathan Pinksa, who really focuses on sustainability. And so all of these perspectives really intertwined and threaded together to come forth with this project. So at its roots, it's a very interdisciplinary project. So today I'm really going to be covering 5 main topics. The first one I'll briefly mention is, why is net zero transport important? Why is it important for us to be discussing this today? Why are governments very focused on ensuring that there is this transition to net zero transport? The second is focusing on our current understanding, particularly based in the literature. What should we be expecting of this transition? What are some of the challenges and tensions that might arise? And the third is, how did we approach this understanding of the current challenges within our research project to better unpick what was happening with the transition to electric mobility in England? What did we find? I'll highlight some of the key cases, what the implications were from that, as well as what next do we need to consider, and hopefully what is some of the conversation that we'll be having today. So to begin, why transport? Why are we interested in studying it? First of all, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, is that transport touches on all aspects of the life and economy. It is a huge contributor to air pollution, noise pollution. It breaks up habitats as it's being developed. It accounted for 29.1% of the territorial greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, and is almost a quarter of the EU's total GHG emissions. And so it has a significant impact on this transition to net zero, particularly by 2050. And as such, there's a significant conversation on how do we encourage this transition to net zero transport. So to begin, I believe that you can respond to this either in the chat or within emojis on Zoom, is how do you generally commute to work? So I'm going to give everyone a moment to type this down either in the chat or react with an emoji so that we can have a better understanding as a group how we commute. I'm seeing a lot of cycling, a lot of biking, public transport, tram, bike and train. Great. So fairly sustainable, using public transport, not a lot of cars, a carpool, Germany tram. So huge diversity. And that will obviously be impacted by the context and what your ability is within your local area. So one of the things that we noticed in scanning the news and what was happening was that the transition to electric mobility was under pressure. Even though a lot of the narrative, there's almost two polarized narrative. One is the inevitability, that this is going to happen, that everything was going to be EVs, that it was just a matter of time. And the other was very much on the opposite side, a very dark, very grim, this is never going to happen. But in general, we described it as an under pressure context. So here's just some of the news articles that were coming out around the time that we were really focusing on this research. For example, the EV strategy needs a rapid recharge, that former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had to delay or felt that he needed to delay the ban on the transition to no new sales of petrol and diesel vehicles. And then The Atlantic putting out a thought piece about the inconvenient truth about EVs, the difficulty of accessing EV charging. And a lot of this narrative was certainly around the lack thereof of EV charging, the inability for people who were driving their cars, not being able to charge at home. That wasn't really in the conversation, but certainly being able to go out and feel safe and secure to either rent an electric vehicle or to be able to leave your home and commute and find charging out of your home, your private residence, say. And so what we found from the beginning was that while some local areas in England certainly showed the potential for a viable market for net zero mobility, in the sense that there was the viable network for electric vehicle charging, there was this transition, there was a conversation, that there was a lot of others were facing an uphill battle in finding this successful opportunity transition for it to be sustainable. And so on the right hand of the screen, you can see this map of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Today, we will just be focusing on England due to the devolution of the governance, but you can see that there is certainly a center around the Southeast where there is greater amounts of public charging, greater accessibility. That really changes when you're going to more rural, more outside, more northern communities that were facing more of a struggle. So that motivated us really to dig down deeper, because governments are obviously facing constrained resources. They have less finances and they're expected to do more. They're expected to not only address the essential services, but these grand challenges that we're facing, including climate crisis. And policymakers are expected not only to just steer and understand creating this arena for the businesses to be able to respond, but they're supposed to be playing a proactive role in this. And that's because there's a recognition that not all technology can address a lot of the underlying issues that cause climate change, and in some cases they can actually exacerbate them. So there's a significant challenge that's being presented not only in the literature but also in our understanding of what needs to be done and what policymakers' role is within it. And so bringing that together, there's scholars of mission-oriented polity, scholars of transition studies that are really advocating for a new role of policymakers to directly engage in an innovation process. So finding these new technologies that can address these grand challenges. And so this is going beyond really solely socializing the risk of getting involved with that to really socializing the advantages as well. So ensuring that new technologies address these challenges, not just ensure that there is an environment to lead to better or more innovation. And so transformative innovation policy is really a broad church framework, but there's two aspects of it that are particularly important to understand for policymakers who are encouraged to approach mission-oriented policies and researchers who are attempting to understand their efficacy. First is that, as I said, we know that some technology can actually exacerbate issues, and we don't know which technologies will be able to effectively address them. And so here, the argument is that policymakers should really be directing. They should be using this understanding of what's happening in the wider environment to say, actually, we do need to go down this pathway. So for example, in the case of transitioning cars, focusing on electric vehicles versus hydrogen, encouraging development in that, banning things that would encourage businesses not to transition. But because we don't necessarily have the technology to address these, the other side of this coin is that they should also encourage distributive experimentation. And what I mean by distributive experimentation is that experimentation should not just be at a central level or in one little area, but it should be spread across areas with different relevant and affected actors, or co-creation, bringing together insight, bringing together expertise to come up with localized solutions. So policy making is supposed to be several things. One, it's supposed to be collaborative. Rather than just endowing central actors to do something, it's supposed to be more open. It's supposed to be adaptive. So ensuring that experimentation is occurring at the local level and responding to that experimentation. And it should also be generative. It shouldn't necessarily set strict targets to meet, because that might discourage the adaptation at the local level. It should be willing to see what is going to happen at that local level and respond to it, and to also encourage new outcomes that can come forthright from that. As such, it's encouraging localized solutions, so solutions found at the local level that can then be scaled. So policymakers are adapting, they're responding to that to then address these ground challenges at the central level. So it almost looks like a feedback loop where you have an agenda setting, so the directionality, and that could look like, for example, the ban on the new sale of petrol and diesel vehicles. It then should go down to distributive experimentation, so diverse local actors such as local governments, firms, citizens collectively coming together to discover solutions. And there can be that loop right there. So distributive experimentation then goes back to policymakers, and you find these small little level solutions. But at the end, you're supposed to kind of bring that back and get some coordinated learning that could then finally influence new agenda setting. And you're going through this loop. But what is our understanding of this? The efficacy of this, what outcomes are happening? Do we understand that it's actually producing the changes, these transformative innovations, to address these grand challenges? First, there is some evidence that suggests that policymakers can and do engage in fruitful experimentation. For example, there's the case that was raised in Finland with the mobility as service and policymakers being able to adapt what was happening there. There's been research in the NHS that looked at how different home technologies were introduced. Policymakers learned about those new technologies and they made alterations to how they introduced it across NHS trusts. So there is some positives that can be shown there. However, there's also pessimism because of the lack of transparency. So if there are some groups that are relevant and effective that are making these decisions, maybe in dispersed locations, but certainly in a much more directly and centralized way? Is that actually inclusive? Are we cutting out a sense of democracy? Is it no longer a democratic decision? And accountability. It's very difficult to set, as I've mentioned, outcomes that can clearly be stipulated when you're talking about experimentation, but governments are expected to be accountable to their communities. They're expected to be accountable for their funding and how they're using their funding. And if you can't demonstrate that you spent 600 million on a new innovation and nothing has come from it, there's questions on whether or not you're really using public funds in the right way. And there's really mixed evidence at the local level with these state-funded and supported initiatives. For example, they have been shown to be effective at encouraging and fostering citywide and project initiatives, for example, with recycling and circular economies. However, they also had significant challenges. Often when there's a lack of funding or when there's a disagreement at the local level, these projects are stymied. There's not a way to move forward and past that, which then raises again the question of accountability. If you're funding these initiatives and they never go to the next step, if they can never be scaled, what are you saying about your long-term policy initiatives and your ability to be held account to them? So with the focus on this very smaller scale initiatives and narrowly defined projects, it offers us limited insights into what can happen when you're trying to do a national level implementation of transformative innovation policies. And that circles us back to the original question of what was happening with the transition to electric mobility and why were there concerns, particularly around the ability for people to charge their vehicles outside of their homes. So rolling out electric vehicle infrastructure is a particularly challenging context. For example, refueling speed and the rapid technology development makes predicting the number of charge points extraordinarily difficult. Refueling speed is getting faster as we're developing if we're rolling out to new rapid chargers and ultra rapid chargers. Technology is also developing, which means that the cars can hold a charge longer. So you could need less chargers over time, as well as the fact that you're also doing innovations that mean that people are more likely or could be able to charge at home. But on the same side, if you're rolling out the charging too slow, you could stifle this transition as people feel uncomfortable about buying electric vehicles. And if people are uncomfortable about buying electric vehicles, they're not investing in the EV charging, which means those businesses are on a very shaky foundation. But rolling out it too quickly can lead to stranded assets. For example, because there's not the funding then to sponsor them, to maintain them, particularly if they're rolled out on government land and local governments need to decide between funding essential services and a charge point technology that they're not even certain is going to be used. So did England necessarily just go about it incorrectly? Was there a sense that maybe they didn't follow this idea of ensuring that there was a clear direction and they didn't fund the experimentation to the extent? And so we looked at whether or not that we could see what was happening with the transition to electric vehicle charging infrastructure in England as even this type of policy. And so this is what we found. First, with the directionality, did they provide an overarching goal? Yes. So they set that very clearly that they wanted a goal of net zero transports and increased business innovation within the decarbonizing transport and a better, greener Britain. They also prioritize the development of EV charging infrastructure, particularly public EV charging infrastructure within the taking charge of the electric vehicle infrastructure strategy. And they also were phasing out the other technology that could exacerbate issues, right? The ban that is delayed, but is still set for 2035 on new sale of petrol and diesel vehicles. And they also proactively engage public and private actors to find solutions. One of the main cases that we were able to hear about, but haven't yet included in a report or a paper, is around Motability. So Motability is a charity that supports those who are disabled in finding solutions to mobility issues. And one of the things that they noticed was that because of the vehicle supply, that a lot of their constituents were going to be transitioning to electric vehicles, but they couldn't use the EV charging that was in the public space. And so they went to the local government. They also worked with charging point firms because the central government, was able to bring people together to have this conversation. And they were able to come up with a recommendation and a statute to be able to approach and how you should design your EV charging infrastructure. So we see all of this demonstrating that, yes, there is a clear setting of directionality. They're certainly taking on their role as a proactive steerer. And they're also funding what is happening. So they're not simply going about and saying, okay, well, we're not sure what's going to happen, and everyone can kind of test their own thing, and we're not going to steer or oversee that. They did proactively fund different projects with the very explicit aim to test solutions in a local area. That was funding that came from Innovate UK that directly funded particular solutions, for example, calls for different types of technology that could be used in public spaces. For example, being able to raise and lower public charge points, being able to roll out public charge points under pavements. And there was also funding that was around cities initiatives. So for example, Go Otrolo program that provided funding to different cities across England. So really trying to focus on not solely funding London, but making sure that there was funding distributed across England to test out these different solutions. And all of these really required multi-actor participation in the trials. It encouraged local governments to be working with firms, to be working with their electricity providers to be able to find these solutions. So Plugged in Place is a very good one, which was a very early initiative that said, well, we need electric vehicle manufacturers involved with this. We need EV charging infrastructure. We need local governments. We need all these people to come together to be talking. But wait, if all of this was going as predicted, or as theorized as should be successful, why was there a challenge? Why, when we were talking to people, did we hear, or not even necessarily needing to talk to people, when we were reading the newspapers, were there cries of this is going to fail, it's going to increase inequalities, we're going to further leave behind different regions? And so that really highlighted this hidden tension, which is that a reliance on bottom-up experimentation might truly clash with the desire to achieve transformative change at a scale, because it won't create those coherent policies across diverse localities. And we're really looking at policy implementation literature, and Matlin from 1995, when he talks about the ambiguity conflict complex, which is when you have all of these types and you're looking at experimentations, it might be good when you don't need to scale it because you're just testing out these local level solutions. You're testing what's happening without expecting the fiat of being able to say that this needs to be done. And so that's where we wanted to go next, which was, okay, so if there might be this tension that is causing this challenge, particularly at the local level, how do actors respond to this tension? How do they see this? How do they deal with this centralized directionality that is telling them that there needs to be a transition to net zero transport? And for England, that a lot of this innovation is focused on developing this charging infrastructure network, that it's focused on ensuring that there is an EV network for those who need it. But how we're going to do this is going to be done through distributed experimentation. So each area, each local area being able to test these different solutions to see, actually, is this the best way that it can be achieved? So how we did this is we focused, as I mentioned, solely on England because of the devolved nation status. And so they've taken this in a very different approach. We looked at the rollout of on-street residential charging, which I'll explain in a second, but it is a particular form of public charging. And we looked at 6 local authorities or local governments, as well as 4 charge point firms that were only focused or mainly focused on on-street residential charging. So if we're looking at the different type of actors that we were interested in initial funding, any local governments could apply. So if you were a ward, if you were different local authority districts, you could apply for this funding to test out different solutions. So if you're looking at what was really well made by a fellow who was also at the Productivity Institute earlier, this map of devolved England governance is it's quite convoluted or incoherent. So there's lots of layering on top of each other. But if you're looking at this map, we were looking truly at 3 or 9, those type of actors and above, thinking about, okay, how these types of actors, this type of local government at this level is responding to this challenge. And on the map on the right, that kind of figure, what here we're looking at is not private charging, because private charging is done by a single actor, whether it's your home or your employer. we're looking at public charging. And in public charging, again, that's broken up into several different areas. There's the residential charging or on the street charging, which is at the top, which is generally slower. It's generally medium expense. And it takes a long time to really charge your battery. You have the car park charging, which again is also very different because it's just in a parking lot. And so we'll talk about the differences later, but it's usually in a space that's already reserved for cars and the parking of cars. And then the third one is motorway. So where you're kind of generally already expecting there to be petrol or diesel stations. So we were interested in particular in residential charging because of the sense of that it's that duality. It's both for private benefit for those who are adopting an EV, but the social justification that allows more people to transition, given that it's going to be on the streets. So it's not going to be hidden either in a home or residency, and it's not going to be hidden in a workplace, so inaccessible to a majority of people. And it's also going to not solely be on the highway, which means it's going to be more expensive. So it's going to be prohibitive being able to enter into that market. So there's also the duality of who's involved with this. So there's going to be both local government who oversees this land, this residential land, as well as the firms. So you're socializing the risk, you're socializing the benefits as well. And just to think about the different types of housing and how that can impact it. And again, in that chat, can you tell me whether where you live, do you have okay, this might be a difference in languages, but do you have a driveway, is what we would say in the States, with a garage, a place to park your car? Do you live kind of in part two, which means it's very quick, quintessential terraced housing in England? Or are you in part three, which is kind of quintessential terraced housing or housing, but that's chopped up? So flats, but not in purpose-built apartments where you would generally have parking. You go ahead and put that into the chat. So lots of threes I'm seeing. Threes or ones. Not a lot of twos. I'll give everyone about 10 seconds more to answer that. So what I'm seeing here is a lot of threes. So you live in a cut up kind of house that's on the main road, or one, so you have the garage. And this is what also makes learning particularly challenging about EV charging infrastructure. Because if you are in an area that has a lot of type 1 houses, and I'm sure there is construction language, and type 1 in the sense of the images that I presented, type 1 houses, you won't need a lot of residential charging because people will likely be able to charge at home. They can put the charger either in their garage, or they can put it next to their door, they can charge it outside. Type 2, however, you're really going to be going onto public land. There's not a place. You really don't want people to be just throwing a cord out their window. You don't want them to be dragging it across the pavement in front of their doors, because of course it could a risk for women with prams, for the elderly. So you're looking more here at that kind of on the street residential charging, where you have a bollard or a lamppost that is in front of your house that is going to be used as charging. And the same with number 3, again, because it's cut up and you don't necessarily have dedicated parking, it's going to be in front of your house. So it's public space, but it feels certainly private because it's in front of your house. And so there's going to be charging there that's needed to be provided because there's not a parking lot that's you can separate out. So we approached this through qualitative research because we were interested not in just, for example, the extent of the rollout, which we could find on ZapMap, but we were really interested in how people were responding to those tensions, responding to the difficulties of doing this. And so we conducted 19 interviews with local authorities and the charge point firms that were rolling it on residential streets. We conducted 3 interviews with central government, and we conducted 17 interviews with the wider context. And that included those who had adopted electric vehicles, included those charge point firms that were rolling out on car parks, who are rolling out with workplaces, who are rolling out on home, and why they had made those decisions rather than trying to work with the local governments and residential charging, as well as district network operators, electricity providers, to really understand how everyone was approaching this and these challenges. And so we broke up our findings into two main findings. One was the tensions that were underpinning engagement and what we framed as intemporal purpose congruence, whether or not people felt that their purposes across present day and future decisions aligned with the overarching demands of what the directionality imposed on them. And the second was whether the differences of capacity and how that affected the experimentation. Alongside that, we really noticed that there was strategies from all of these different actors in response to what these tensions fostered in these local areas. One was this circumvention of it. Another was this navigation or attempt to come closer and address it. And the third was really embracing these collaborative tensions. So to begin, we saw really two questions when there was an unshared temporal horizon. So when our actors at the local level, our charge point firms and our local authorities didn't necessarily align in how they saw the future, what questions were they asking themselves? The first one was concurrent decisions, what we're making decisions about now, does that align with our future aspirations? Engaged local authorities often viewed themselves, described themselves, and were described as by others as pioneering, progressive, forward thinking. And that often connected it to them seeing net zero as crucial to their future because of its relevance to their local industries and their past. And I have a really lovely quote from one of our local authorities that says that very clearly. When I asked, why do you think that you were involved in this? And they responded, history, I suppose. You know, because it's an automotive industry, very much emerges or is part of the inheritance of our region. So the inheritance, this future oriented but connected to the past mentality. The second for our firms is the CEOs of the charge point firms really saw themselves as responding to solving local societal challenges. That was a huge part of their identity. And that's not the literature that we really built ourselves in, but I think there's a huge question around identity and entrepreneurship, and they truly saw themselves as future-oriented entrepreneurs. And then the second question that they asked themselves was, do future benefits justify the current challenges that we're going to face now in terms of our responsibilities to others? So first and foremost, local authorities needed to meet current needs of their residents, the essential services that they're legally obligated to deliver. Alongside that is that the charge point firms actually needed to make a return on investment. So they couldn't just roll it out in the hopes of making an income later at a future date. And there's a really lovely quote there from one of our charge point firms on this challenge and the recognition of this challenge in particular for local authorities. And where is EV charging in that list of that menu of things that they, local authorities, need to get done? Let's be really honest. There's some really important stuff that local authorities doing. Is EV charging important at all compared to those other things? And so there's recognition certainly from the charge point companies of really what was happening and the challenges that are occurring for local authorities. And on the other side, one of the charge point firms described their challenge as really rolling everything out now in the hopes of being able to achieve something in the future, but really coming close to a breaking point at this point, where everyone was starting to look at each other and think, oh, actually, are we doing this in a hope of something that might actually not occur? And if it doesn't occur in the timeline that we need it to, how are we going to be financially secure? The second part was this, do they have the capacity to engage in the experimentation to ensure that the overall transition actually met the needs of their local areas? The first question, a very basic question, was can we actually afford to sustain this? So a lot of the early funding was competitive bidding. And so you would put forth a bid and you could justify it, then you would receive the funding. The difficulty with that, though, is that it became a virtuous cycle. So those early winners were then given more funding when they applied to the central government because they had already proven that they could effectively roll out EV charging infrastructure. And two of our local authorities really talk about that was a sense of pride in that they had won it early, that they had demonstrated their efficacy, and that they were able to win more funding, and so that they could actually respond to the challenges that they faced as well as the needs of their residents. As well as that was that there's this ongoing funding was tapered even until now, is that the earlier funding is slowly being reduced as the central government encourages private investment, but that's not necessarily meeting the challenges of what local governments need to do because it's not part of their essential services, even though they are expected to be engaging in this transition to net zero. as well as this, there's a lack of knowledge related to this greater expense. One of the local authorities gave us an example of going out and surveying their residents and everyone picking a particular spot near a swimming pool that would be a great place for a charging point to go in because it would be well used. However, because they didn't have the funding until after they had done this initiative, they later found out that they actually couldn't place the charge point there because it was too expensive to change the actual distribution of the electricity going to that spot. And so they had to choose a different spot, which then all of that expense of going out and contacting and engaging residents really led to an answer that wasn't what they wanted or needed because they couldn't do it in the first place. And so there's that recognition is that everyone's under pressure. Local authorities are under pressure. All their budgets are being squeezed. So really is engagement in this something that they couldn't sustain. And the next part, and really interconnected with that, is do we know what to do? Because charge point technology is always evolving, there's a sense both on this charge point firms and on the local authorities that it's very challenging to learn everything that is happening, to be fully aware of everything that is happening, particularly because a lot of the administrative procedures are not designed for this digital novel infrastructure. So it's designed for infrastructure such as huge water transplant. It's designed for completely different things. And so each local authority will have a different way to approach that, more proactive ones, maybe more willing to negotiate the gray spaces, less proactive ones, maybe much more focused on the regulatory initiatives. And so the firms are really struggling to kind of achieve that scale, and they're constantly responding to the different challenges. And for the local authorities, there's a clear sense of your actual institutions that surround you have a huge impact on your ability to have that capacity. So one of our local authorities really said, so I think it's different. I mean, there's an aspect to this challenging circumstances that we are very, very lucky with the people we have. We've been very lucky to have access to these institutions. And I like that they use luck there. It's something that this local authorities earned, but it's what's been given to them. It's the kind of the draw of the card. And because of that, because of who's around them in this point of time, they're able to have this extra support. So how they responded to it was quite interesting. Some of them actually just circumvented it. They said, oh, it's very too difficult to actually work with local governments. We don't really want to socialize the benefits at the moment because we're dealing with too much risk. So they hide these immediate challenges by highlighting that future potential, what can be. So particular CPOs, and that's for those who decided to work with local authorities and those who did not, highlight the potential of the business models, the social benefits, and a lot of these conversations, when we would start to focus on the challenging aspects for local authorities, the conversation would completely turn in that moment because they would certainly start describing to me this utopia of what could be as long as they were able to roll out their new technology. And so it's attempting to change that temporal focus. Don't worry about today because the future is going to be so much better. And the second thing that we really noticed was this idea of privatization of this net zero challenge. So some of them, particularly the ones who did not work with local authorities, said, we really shouldn't be actually trying to address unequal access because that's not the way to think about it. What we really want to be thinking about at the moment is just getting people to transition. It should be market-driven, market-focused. This is how we should be doing. This is how you truly have success because it's driven by choice. Or you have on the same side the emphasis on individualized solutions, such as active travel. And this is not us saying that active travel is negative. It's not us saying that people shouldn't be encouraged to do active travel. What we did notice, however, was when we asked questions about the challenges, for example, of not providing it for those who needed to have EVs for example, with Motability talking to us, and they would just say, oh, well, we want to encourage, this is not really our problem. You know, everything should be different this way, this utopia. And again, that's selling of a utopia where everyone can engage in active travel in a very easy manner. And so one of our local authorities responded in a very similar sense of that it's just the market's problem, it's not really ours. And they said it's quite expensive to install EV charging. And so if the private sector is picking it up, why would we feel that we have to intervene any more than we intervene in charging with hydrogen or petrol? The next thing that we saw was, while we did see that some of the CPOs did try a contempt to work with local authorities, and local authorities did reach out and try to work with CPOs. And what we described this was navigating shared interests. in the sense that you attempt to navigate about, where you kind of see where the other person is going, you're steering yourself closer, but you're steering yourself. There's an active sense of trying to navigate the situation, influence the situation. And the first thing that we saw that was, in just a very basic sense, an attempt to find common ground, not saying that this is either a public sector issue or a private sector market issue, but that in actuality, there's probably a bit of both. And so how to find that is engaging in this state-sponsored collaboration. Because even when it moved away from non-competitive bidding, or you could open bids, not everyone engaged in it. So there was a sense of being able to see, okay, we both want something out of this, was a bit of finding the common ground. The next was that they designed the technology to address the resource constraints and the concerns about residents' disinterest. So one of the key issues, going back to that picture of the houses, the terrace houses, all next to each other, a lot of the concerns came from residents who were saying, I don't want my neighbor's car parked in front of my house because the charge point can be there. That's not fair. This is my land, even though technically it's publicly owned. And so charge point firms would work with local authorities to say, well, we're just going to use lampposts because lampposts are already there. So you're not going to be taking up space that's given to the community. It's much more cost effective. Or you see solutions about, for example, the charge point kind of going back into the ground. You see Internet of Things, so different solutions that are addressing some of these resource constraints, easy to scale, and gives benefits to the community beyond just the charge point. And there's also a narrative building that was around this that's emphasizing the significance of their joint effort. And so it's constantly talking about us in a sense of partnership with a lot of that language. A lot of local authorities would say our contracting out, we procure. CPOs would say our partner, this joint effort, this collaborative endeavor. So there is this sense of the firms in particular building on this idea that this is something that is a joint effort, a collaborative endeavor, a collective rather than just a market or government. And for the local authorities, they really attempted to use public and community metrics to determine optimal site selection. So that's surveying residents, that's going out to the local community and asking them what they wanted. And so what's interesting is that, again, was still navigating this interest. So they would build off this idea that the CPOs were saying that this is a joint endeavor. And they would respond by saying, well, if this is a joint endeavor, then let us choose where these charge point firms go, because then it is based upon the community. And in response, when we were talking to a lot of the charge point firms, they would say, well, that's helpful. It's good to know that the community wants us, but we've developed this technology, these software systems that really show where people want. And as much as someone says that they're going to use something, you have to take that really with a grain of salt. And so even this engagement in this narrative, this engagement of defining the common ground, was often dependent on whether or not there was funding. So as much as, for example, the charge point firms emphasize this as a joint endeavor, they simultaneously would say, but it's not our responsibility. We cannot fund. They should use government grants if they want to put it in a location that isn't financially sustainable for us. Simultaneously, local governments were interested in engaging and working with charge point firms insofar as that there was the money to provide to pay for the staff and the people who could work with them to do it. And so when there was a lack of funding or movement away from funding from one tier of local government to another tier, there was a sense of, well, we can't keep the team here because there's no one, we can't fund it anymore. But I do like one of the quotes from our charge point firms is that they really do, and this is important to emphasize, the language of democracy, inclusion, or what the charge point firms are really building into. And so he just bluntly says, we think about the basicality to democratize access. So people with driveways currently are those who are high net worth and are having an already privileged EV charging experience relative to those who depend on an on-street service to park a car that has access to employment, access to healthcare. Some of our charge point firms we noticed as embracing collaborative tensions alongside of our local governments, which was going beyond the sense of it needs to have funding attached. There needs to be a clear benefit for us to being able to move beyond cautiously managing challenges to sharing them. And that's establishing broad-based coalitions to protect disruptive innovations. So that's proactively engaging local communities. One of the charge point firms that we talked to I found out that they were just going to local community markets. And when I asked whether or not they had won the contract with that local government, they said no, but it's beneficial for local communities to know what is happening, what's going on, what can be done. We had local firms talking about really just promoting it, being there, being positive, talking to people who had concerns, and as well as adaptively sharing the competencies and knowledge. Rather than when you look a lot of the transaction cost economics, or when you look at contracting languages where it's about this principal agent discrepancies, we do see people really being willing to navigate and go above and beyond what is viewed normally as one challenge versus another challenge. So local governments really navigating regulatory procedures with their firms, CPOs overseeing that customer/resident relationship, taking on some of that administrative burden, creating shared software systems so that, for example, a local government can just access a web page and see whether or not charge point firms are being used. And that wasn't always the case. We did ask some local governments and they said no, they're very closed off with their data versus others. And for local governments, we saw often a proactive attempt to create sharing learning networks within local regions. So ensuring that if you're in Brighton, if you're in Lancaster, if you're in Manchester, that information is being shared so that you can best support an overall transition, which is beneficial to the charge point companies that really need that scale to be able to be financially sufficient. So this was one of the interesting quotes that came from overseeing that customer service or community relationship. And the response that we do, and they're talking about here, when local residents say, we don't want a charge point here, we want to be able to park here whether or not we're charging our car, is that they say that they're going to be extremely flexible, rather than saying that this spot needs to only be for EV, that they're saying, no, it's okay. Right now, this is not what the community wants. And that's not always the case. Some of our charge point firms said that, nope, once it's in, it should be only for EVs, because if one EV person can't park there at any given time, that hurts our brand and it's not good overall. So this ever-present challenge that we notice is that implementation challenges stem from relying on local actors to resolve what is really essentially national conflicts and ambiguities through experimentation, while trying to at the same time assure radical policy objectives. So this is a transition that is disruptive. It's going to cause people need to rethink how they fuel their vehicle. No longer do you just drive to a petrol station. It might take 9 hours at your home or an on street. You might need to actually forward think when you're going to be fueling your vehicle. And so that is disruptive. And if you're trying to have local actors solve that, it causes a lot of tension. And this is one of slides that was provided by one of our case sites. And they talk about kind of the central government having these expectations, this lightning bolt that's being thrown down at these local authorities, these houses, the horses that are terrified, because at the bottom of that, there's a bunch of snakes that are saying, oh, what's net zero actually? What does that mean? What does that language even say? What's electric vehicles? Will they work? Is it going to be fair? How do we adapt? What's the wider outcome? And what are these outcomes that we don't even know that are happening? And so this top-down architecture in the Transformative Innovation Policy framework is important because it allows policymakers to disrupt, right? That lightning bolt, that stick that's saying, no, you need to make this change. You need to have this. And that can be positive when you don't see, for example, that there is going to be a disruption. So there's a sense that you can maybe speed up this transition and address these sustainability challenges in a timely manner. However, experimentation in itself results in some failure. There's going to be some outcomes that are negative, but that can challenge the local actors' purpose, particularly local governments, because they need not only to respond to these national mandates, but they also need to respond to their residents' needs. And the charge point firms are going to have to simultaneously be balanced that responses at the local level with also their national objectives and their desire to be financially solvent. And so what we came with was a framework that we think that policymakers and researchers should consider when they're looking at innovation pathways. And first and foremost, importantly, is the political, legal, financial, and administrative context. So we very much talked about the transition in the perspective of England, where there is a significant amount of terrace housing, where devolution and what that looks like, and the tiers of local government are evolving and often very, very complicated. So that will make it different in a different context. But we also encourage them, for example, if you're a policymaker, you're probably trying to make it more difficult to circumvent these tensions. You're trying to really look at, well, what's happening in the circumvention? What are the key things that are driving people to circumvent? And you're really looking at the purpose, whether it's congruent with your local actors and the capacity of your firms to be able to respond to these needs. Because one of the things that our firm said was that not all SMEs and not all businesses can really navigate these challenges. And so you lose also a lot of innovative solutions because of the fact that you really cannot engage in this. And the same thing for local governments. It's encouraging, it's looking at, okay, but they're navigating, they're sharing these interests. How do they embrace them? What's happening here? What's going on in this middle section that really leads to the implementation of disruptive sustainability through distributive experimentation? So some of our policymaker implications and areas of future research that we think should be highlighted is that there's a sense of techno-optimism, or this sense of ideology that technology is going to save us. We just have to wait. We just have to get past this little bump in the road. And that's endemic to sustainable transitions. And that's not how necessarily communities are feeling, and that can really just hide the challenges to a later date when they rear their ugly heads. Connected to that is that we need to really recognize, particularly at the centralized directionality setting, these local pressures, as the failures can obscure the efficacies of solutions and objectives. Returning to a lot of that earlier newspaper clippings is that they overemphasize the failures because of local pressures, and you're obscuring what the successes are because you're focusing on what's going wrong, because you're so focused on, oh, well, it's just going to be okay. You have one side just saying everything's going to be okay, and one side saying, oh, it's all a failure. You're not really recognizing either side and where that balance can be achieved. And that means you really do need to dedicate substantial time and resource. I think a lot of the times mission-oriented policies are just a reinventation of just saying the government should steer and not really provide the resource for it. And that's where there should be high levels of caution. If the government is attempting to foster disruptive change, it needs to foresee the long-term implications for that as well. And that also means preparing for divergent and sometimes conflicting outcomes. For example, we had some local authorities do very, very different things simultaneously that could detract from the other decisions. And it's a conflict. Well, why do both? Why not just do one or the other? And it's because experimentation will lead to that. It will lead to one area doing one thing, one other area doing another thing. Those two things not aligning necessarily. For example, you could have one city that has a lot of on-street residential charging and the next local area to it having nothing. When I was talking to a borough in London, so there's really a very fine line between one borough and another. And I asked, well, are you talking to the borough next door because you're doing this and they're doing the direct opposite? And they said, no, it's not our responsibility. But I think you need to be recognizing that those differences, and they admitted themselves that that is going to cause a bit of tension, but oh, it's fine because people will just work it out. And I think the government should be proactive about that. And a part of that is actually supporting this broader grassroots movement, rather than just having that lightning bolt at the top and saying, this is what's going to be done. Really foster this idea of what it will look like. Don't no longer assume that citizens are going to passively accept this demand for change. Really attempt to be part of that deliberative democracy. And that might be in focusing more on deliberative democracy at the local level and proactively addressing when things are different, rather than throwing up your hands and saying, well, things are different, so it's not working, and oh dear, but it will work, so everything's going to be okay at the end. Don't have any worries, but also worry quite a lot. It's about moving that. What does it look like? What are we expecting? What do we hope to have? And being really honest with those challenges, as experimentation will lead to those conflicts often. And thank you so much. That's what I have for my prepared talk, and I'm really looking forward to kind of having a discussion with everyone.
Thank you very much, Britt. Thank you for the presentation and many, many insights. We do already have, of course, questions in the Q&A session, but before I start, I just wanted to invite Serena and Lara to also join us here as well. And then I would like to ask the participants to please post your question in the Q&A session that we have opened here, and then we can slowly go through them. But we have a first question, and for this question, I will read it out in a second, but Edel, I'm also going to ask you to switch on your camera and then maybe help us explain the resource nexus, because I think you're a much better person for that than me. So Britt, Edel already turned on her camera. She's the director of UNU Flores, and Edel, I'll let you ask the question yourself as well.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And I was just thinking the whole time, where is now the link to the Nexus, because it's the Nexus seminar. But then over the time, I thought, no, you always talk about tensions. So I can already see the similarities. But so when we talk about the Nexus, maybe I start here. So Nexus is just the Latin word for link. And the Nexus was Nexus concept was first developed in the 90s by a focus on energy and food. And later in 2011, there was a focus then on water, energy, food. You might have heard of the WEF Nexus, very often more in economic, on the national economic scale. We at UNU Flores, we focus on the resource nexus, so broader. It's also water, it's also energy, it's also food. But we also focus on soil. We focus on materials, for example, very important topic in your case. Space, not outer space. Outer space might also be relevant when it comes to waste, but really space, the space you need to put your vehicles in. I think that's also part of your topic. Biodiversity. So the biodiversity COP is starting around these minutes in Cali in Colombia, and we look at the environmental resources and the Nexus. So this is not my question here regarding the environmental part of the Nexus, but just, have you heard of the concept Nexus? What is a tension? We then look at synergies, we look at trade-offs. Can you just describe what do you analyze when you analyze tensions? And this is it's a discussion Samanthi was starting, that's also in the management literature, to find literature on the Nexus. Maybe Samanthi, this could be a first link to connect the two concepts. So this is a seminar here. Therefore, I just would like to have some creative ideas. It's not a question for knowledge, but just to develop new ideas. So also Samanthi, you might want to add, or Serena, or whoever is in the room, just join us.
Thank you, Ida. Britt, do you wanna say something first?
I think you go ahead. I think that's quite interested in hearing your perspective.
Yeah, so just in general, I'm sometimes it's the resource nexus, but then it's also multidisciplinary perspectives of sustainability for the full context. That's how we approaching the topic. And so Britt, from my perspective, we are connecting around the sustainability topic much more. And so for me, the Nexus topic, that's why I also asked you, Edo, to introduce it. It's not always so clear what it means and how to use it. So with that in mind, for the interconnectivities around the tensions, I think that's a really interesting link to the sustainability discussions that we see. And then, but you also, Jonathan, there with the paradoxes and the tensions with the work there. So I see a lot of links there around the topic. But I don't see it so strongly in the management literature. And then again, Britt is not a management scholar, of course. I do see that the environmental sub-aspects that you highlighted, Edel, are not so strongly presented there. So I think it requires quite a lot of explanation to link it back and embed it.
Maybe just one thought. I was just listening and had some thoughts. When we talk about net zero, I think that somehow also might contradict, not necessarily this Nexus concept. And this is my huge critique, also has been my critique, having been a chairwoman in the International Organization for Standard for many years, when the carbon footprint was introduced. We focused then on one dimension only. And I is really wrong. And this is currently actually also discussed in Cali at the Biodiversity COP. We look at climate change, we look at biodiversity, we have pollution, to speak of the triple planetary crisis. If we only look at one target like this net zero for CO2 emissions, that might be misleading. That is maybe a way to approach the topic and also to integrate the nexus from a broader perspective in, outside the resource nexus concept. Maybe let's keep it like that, not only in management, in all areas, actually, even in our daily life.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Edel, for the context. I think that really helps in terms of also this multidimensionality, I think that you very much highlighted just now. Maybe one question that I would draw out, Edel, from here, which I'm really interested to hear a response, Britt, is whether you've come across the resource nexus before. Is that something you're familiar with? Is that something that in your scientific sphere in which you're working is something that came up before?
In terms of, can you explain what you mean, what you're defining as research nexus?
No, either can, but just the term resource nexus. I'm sure you came across like the subcategories of the resource nexus with the soil and and the food and the water, and then the interlinkages and the interdependencies. But if the term resource nexus is something that you came across with and you came across in your work.
Not in particular, actually, not in something that is really drawn out or discussed extensively. So in terms of perhaps the interrelatedness or the interdependencies of resources, but not framed in that sort of language, not beyond, for example, environmental management, not something broader than that. In particular, if we're thinking about the effects of interrelatedness and interdependencies, what I find interesting and perhaps missing, at least when we drew out the mission innovation policy literature, the transformative innovation literature, is it certainly did seem to eschew or downplay the interdependencies at that local level. So the interdependencies that would occur between, because of my interest in public policy and public participation, communities and these innovation policies, that these experiments would be, and in this sense, very much in the sense of environmental management as well, that these experimentations would be entirely dependent on the local nexus. So this, whether or not they had the resources to engage in this type of experimentation, whether that's community deliberation, community participation, the actual environment to be able to engage in it, whether or not there is sidewalks, not sidewalks, that's a huge aspect that I feel often, and you might be able to correct me, Samanti, because you are much more versed in the sustainability literature, is something that is downplayed as that this can happen, we can get past this, almost moving beyond context rather than emphasizing how that will affect our understanding of it.
Thank you, Britt. And then Serena, I have a question, and then I'll continue in the Q&A. And if anyone has further questions in the meantime, just post it into the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you. And I see, so I think Daniel's question was very similar. Do you want to answer that first, or was that answered by Edel? It's also about the research out is presented to the Nexus approaches in managing. I think, Daniel, did that answer your question, or did you have a follow-on that?
I would say the question is pretty much the same as Edel's. Maybe quickly adding to that, firstly, I think it was nevertheless very good to have this topic in today's Nexus seminar, as the transition to electric mobility is one of the greatest sustainability transformations that we are currently seeing. And we are seeing very similar challenges, for example, here in Germany, where the speed of this transition is not as fast as decision makers have been hoping for, especially since at the end of last year, we reduced the subsidies that people could get for electric vehicles. So this year, I just looked at the number, only a bit more than 200,000 new electric vehicles have been registered in Germany. So making up a relatively small fraction of the total number of new vehicles that are sold. And this clearly shows that the challenges that you mentioned are, I think, very much also slowing down the acceptance here. When it comes to the Nexus perspective, I would maybe like to add to what Edel said, that on the one hand, when we speak of net zero, yes, this is what everybody has on their mind. We are buying electric vehicles because they have a tag or a sticker attached to them saying 0 grams of CO2 emissions per 100 kilometers or per kilometer of driving range. That's good. Electric mobility also has a substantial contribution on decreasing urban air pollution. So there is benefits. There are points where I would say electric mobility has zero benefit, but it does no harm. For example, when it comes to land consumption or the space that we are using for road transport, it doesn't make a difference if a vehicle has an internal combustion engine or if it's electric. But then there are also side effects. If we look at the batteries that use resources that we get from all parts of the world and that are still difficult to recycle, there are new environmental challenges. And I think this is exactly what Edel meant when she said reducing things to net zero. Net zero is often defined as net zero CO2 emissions. I think we should better speak of zero impact, looking at the all over environmental impacts that new technologies have. And maybe that's enough just to add that it is really meaningful to look at the environmental impacts in a holistic way. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Samantha, can I go ahead? I have a question. I started typing, but it's a long story. So for me, Britt, this is really interesting, the governance side of this, because I've worked with geospatial data sets, and then the aim is to integrate them. You get them at the local authority, and you want to create national data sets out of them. And a lot of what you showed today, you have exactly the same challenges, this tension between local and national, and the top-down versus the bottom-up. I don't know if you've seen that book by some TU Delft authors about inverse infrastructures, which is very interesting on how you manage this top-down versus bottom-up, because if you want to create any kind of transition like this, you will always come across this tension. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you is you also showed a map of all the administrative boundaries of, is it the UK, I think? So my question there is, did you come across this problem that people try to manage things within administrative boundaries, but maybe the way to implement it doesn't follow the administrative boundaries? I'm listening to that book on information nexus at the moment, and he says we are trying to box ourselves into things. And this just is, I think, a good example of that, don't you think? Did you come across this problem? You're muted.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And yes, we did see, well, I didn't go really in depth into it because that was the first 4 parts of the map of England. And then there's about 16 more that get layered on top of that. That further entrenches the sense of discontinuity between the different layers of governance. And that was often what was conflicting, was because if you're looking now, right now, the government's policy and the funding that is going out, the local electric vehicle infrastructure fund, LEVI funds, is at a tier 1 level. So that's a certain type of level of local authority. So you're thinking of a unitary, but a broader level, for example. However, previously, you could have done it at a more local level. So if you're thinking of a city. And so there are often what were described as tensions between rural and urban areas within 2 different areas, or right next to each other, having very, very different responses coming across it very differently, and the back and forth that occurs there. And as well, one of the cities that we were talking to was talking about really needing to trust and hand over a lot of the work that they had done, a lot of the effort, a lot of their relationships to a higher level, because at that point, that's what the government had decided to do, is put it at an upper level. Because that then made sense. And again, as you said, there is this push-pull between responding to these transitions as well. You want it to be rooted in the challenges of the local communities and the local areas. They have this expertise. England definitely, policymakers recognize that. At the same time, you don't want it to be incoherent. You don't want to leave areas behind just because the policymakers or the politics at that very, very local level don't align with what the national center is trying to do. So yes, we did see that tension and that complication really play out throughout that. And it was more of a highlight in the report that we made for the Productivity Institute than what I presented on here, which was exploring the tensions. And I think there was a question of what those tensions meant. And what we focused on in those tensions was the relational tension, what was happening, because we really focused on this idea that if you're making this transition, it's inherently about transitioning these relationships as well, how they work with each other, how they view each other, how they deal with these challenges. And that, again, was that tension, was for the CPOs in particular. Well, we've been funded to make this huge transition. But if one little area is saying one thing to us, but then we go to the person that actually gets the money and they're telling us the direct opposite, like who do we believe? Who do we trust? Who do we talk to? That's a great question.
Thank you, Britt. And then there's two more questions, and I'll start with the second one. The results presented seem to be mainly economic and technology oriented. Were there any environmental concerns brought up by the interviewees?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, it's the second one. So it's I started with the second one. Were there any environmental concerns brought up by the interviewees?
There were environmental concerns brought up by some of the interviewees. And when you mean by environmental, I'm guessing you're talking about environmental fragmentation to the extent of
probably the natural environment and the resource nexus as in water, energy, food, around that. Yeah.
So I think we did have some raised concerns, particularly around the idea that this is something that the local government should not be involved in. And I talked about that in the sense of intertemporal purpose congruence, was that, well, the batteries, the cars are heavier, the batteries themselves cause environmental challenges. So as a government, we shouldn't be doing something. We shouldn't be sponsoring this. We shouldn't be involved in this. We highlighted this more in the sense of how they viewed themselves, as we were focused on really the sense of how do these tensions impact their relationships and how they viewed their approach to this overall transition.
Thank you. And then I'll switch to the first question in case you want to read it with me. So it's, which would be the best strategy to assess and overcome cross-sectoral incoherence, such as transition to e-mobility and non-renewable energy matrix context?
That's a very good question. I would be hesitant to say I have the answer to that question, given that my focus of the research was really on what was happening, but a strategy to assess and overcome cross-sectoral incoherence. So if you're thinking about cross-sectoral, I'm going to assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Louisa, that you're meaning the challenges that was faced between the firms and the public local government. So working across the private sector and the public sector. I would say one of the biggest challenges on both sides was for the private sector, was that they were dealing with 309 different local areas that had radically different, and what I just mentioned, because of the multi-level governance approaches that made it quite confusing. They have this idea of a central mandate, but in reality, when they're talking to people, that mandate dissipates, it disappears, it becomes different. And on the other side, you have local governments who are facing extremely constrained resources and private sector organizations that are mostly enterprises, SMEs. And so they're also learning as they're going. And so the best strategy to overcome would be that dedication at the beginning, is sitting down and saying, okay, here's the funding, here's the resources, planning out, being willing to adapt that. I'm not throwing generativity out of the door, but I think one of the things that we have seen happen is a sense that it's austerity light. Oh, this is just another way for the government not to actually have to spend money on this transition. To assess, I think there is becoming much better, and it might be very different in a context that's not England. But because of the fact that the multi-level governance is shifting within England, so I'm not sure if people are aware, but they're already continuing to do devolution deals now within the Labour government. And the Labour government is also not enforcing devolution deals. What they're instead doing is saying, well, we're going to create a new working group that mayors are going to be invited to, that devolved nations are going to be invited to. And guess what? You won't be invited if you don't choose the way that we want you to govern. And so I think that's one of the challenges is how do you assess when you don't have a level to assess? I think it's being very clear at what level you want coherency, at what level do you report that, and how do you give support to that once, if it doesn't meet the measurement that you want to. And again, being willing to adapt if you notice that, for example, you don't need as many cars as you expected because they're you've put in a railway or you've done a different approach to it.
Thank you, Britt. And I can see, Louisa, you have a follow-up question?
Yes, just a follow-up. Thank you very much again for the amazing presentation. It's very interesting, but also not only the public and the private, but among, for example, the energy sector with the transportation sector, and as also battery was mentioned, so the waste management sector. How can you actually coordinate this transition in a way that they are not causing these incoherencies?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for explaining. I think, yes, that's helpful to know. So one of the things that was happening, and again, I didn't get into the technicalities, so I'm not realizing I should have. So the DNOs, the district network operators, were not required to participate in this. And so the Netherlands did a much more DNO-led approach to this, which often meant that it was only dependent upon the relationship between the DNO and the pre-existing local government, whether or not the DNO was aware and responsive in supporting this transition. The problem with that was that it was already these progressive local governments that had those relationships, unsurprisingly. So it further entrenched these inequalities. I think a different way to approach that is rather than saying, well, it's up in the air, it's going to happen, that they're going to work together, actually sitting down and saying, well, we know they need to work together, so we're going to add that as part of their problems that they need to address or part of their services that they need to address. I think that, again, that goes back to what I was saying, which is you can also use this as a way to continue to do austerity, which is if you don't mandate it, if you don't say that you need to do it, then you don't need to fund it. And I think that's probably one of the largest challenges. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
And then we have from the audience, we have one last question, and then I would like to also squeeze in my very last question, and then we'll close the Q&A just as an outlook. So this is a longer comment, so if you want to read along. So thank you for your presentations. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the concept of impact. At first glance, the impact of the measures described by you would be reduced greenhouse gas emissions from public transport, contributions towards net zero with the obvious and discussed limitations. However, Magdalena is generally interested in your take on impact based on your research. Would you say that impact in your research, in your field of research, lies all the same within the establishment of a nexus of distributed experimentation, coordinated learning, agenda setting towards transition? So would impact, in your view, rather be related to measuring outcomes or to creating impact-oriented structures? So to summarize, what I think Magdalena is asking that is, when you think of yourself as a researcher creating impact, how would you measure your research impact? I hope I translated that, so that in a good way, Magdalena.
So if I'm thinking of the research based on the impact based on my research, so I think when I framed at the beginning why we're interested in this question, because the question starts with the GHG emissions, is that's where the interest arose from. So this is, irregardless of our take on net zero, this was a significant area of interest for policymakers. So for the impact of our research, I think that it falls more into the latter, is not really focused on saying that in actuality, we need to reduce outcomes, the GHG, by a certain amount by this time. Is that there needs to be clear impact-oriented structure. So there needs to be almost in a sense of this idea that we're moving towards something and we're actually going to proactively try to be involved with what that looks like. we're going to set up the forums that need to be happening at the different levels to have these discussions when they don't go wrong. What it feels at the moment is actually a certain percentage of cars haven't been bought, a certain percentage of EV CEI hasn't been rolled out, so we're going to delay the ban. But there wasn't really a conversation on, well, what are we actually looking for so we can say that we are moving forward towards our goal. This yes or no question makes it very difficult. So our impact based on our research would be broader conversations around the transition where they're happening either at a devolved level. So there is transport boards now in these different regions. They don't have any mandated or oversight. They don't have any control, right? So they have responsibility to support, but they have very little ability to enforce that or to do anything. So that could look like them having a better oversight, them being held more accountable. And I think there is a sense of a lack of accountability in this, because what happens if there is community disinterest? What happens if the community does think that there's something going wrong? Right now, it's so broad that there is just this transition that we're not really certain what's going to be tested or shown to demonstrate that it has had a positive effect or a positive response at that local level.
Thank you, Britt. My question is, from the insights that you shared, it seems like you have such a broad and in-depth data set, and you collected so many insights. I was wondering if there's something that has really surprised you, either in a positive or in a negative way, where you said, "Oh wow," in any way. So I'm wondering about that.
That's a really interesting question. I think I found particularly interesting was that almost the sentiment of, well, this transition is going to happen. And so it's okay that at some points we're going to be increasing inequality. It's okay because some eggs just have to be broken. And I was having this discussion with another researcher lately who's in political science. And we were talking about this idea that because this transition is a positive, I think we can, or any transition, or being more aware of nexuses or environmental management and what's happening, that it's okay to leave some communities behind, that it's okay not to listen to their concerns, that it's acceptable to tell them that they're wrong and that they should really just change their mindset. And I think I found that very surprising and concerning. I think there is a sense that we almost think that we can browbeat people into accepting that this is going to happen and telling them that their worries are meaningless. And hopefully that there is a sense and a recognition that in reality that's going to cause a pushback. It's going to, there is going to be polarization, and that's not perhaps the way that we should be approaching this.
Thank you, Britt. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights, and then also for having all of the questions that we had. I would just like to mention to the group that we have the next Nexus seminar coming up on November 18th, and we'll have a professor from TU Dresden presenting. Please stay tuned on the diverse channels on who it will be. And with that, thanks again, Britt. Yeah, all the best for your research and your continuing research. And thank you everyone for listening and dialing in, and Dinara and Serena for co-hosting.
From our side. Thanks, Britt. It was very interesting.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the very challenging and interesting questions as well.
And with that,
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.